r/askreddit. Serious, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy are well known, but what are some other dark pasts from other countries that people might not know about? Same war, but Japanese treatment of Chinese people is also a stain on human history. The Cambodian Khmer Rouge killed 1.8+ million people over about 4 years. Rohingya people have been treated pretty awfully wherever they went, and very recently have been victims of ethnic cleansing in Myanmar, something that seemingly went largely ignored by Western media. The genocide in Rwanda killed between 500k to a million in a most gruesome way. The Khmer Rouge were nuts. 1.8+ million is a lot of people. But when you realize that it was almost a quarter of the entire population, it becomes especially eye-opening. A quarter of the population. In 4 years. They would kill you if you wore glasses or owned books. Anything that could lead to an impression that you were anything other than an illiterate farmhand. And Pol Pot died peacefully of natural causes without being held for his crimes. The genocide in Rwanda killed between 500k to a million in a most gruesome way. By hand, with machetes. Between April and July 1994, at least 500,000 people were hacked to death with machetes. My high school in the US did a whole semester on the Rwandan genocide when I was a senior. We had to read autobiographies of survivors and we watched a ton of movies. Immaculée Ilibagiza even came to speak at the end of the year. It was insane to meet her after hearing about all she had been through personally. The thing that was so striking was how young she was, only in her mid-30s. We had Holocaust survivors come another year, and it really hit home at how recently it happened. As middle-class teenagers, we were so used to thinking that bad things like this happened so long ago, and it really was a wake-up call. It was an incredible experience, and I'm glad for whichever teacher had the idea to put the whole thing together. Japanese treatment of POWs generally was absolutely awful. The stories about the Burmese railway construction are shocking. Well, Belgium has the Congo. Is quite a handful if you know what I mean. Yet Leopold II literally invented corporate evil. First time I read about this, I literally said to myself, Belgium? Like, cute little Belgium? Well, the Turks are still trying to deny the Armenian Holocaust. That's one thing I always thought. It was hilarious about that Young Turks show, the Armenian co-host. I see what you're doing there, man. Francoist Spain is somehow forgotten among Americans despite lasting to the 70s. Trust me, is forgotten even here in Italy. Most young people don't even know who Franco is. Residential schools in Canada. Stories of residential schools never fail to make my blood run cold with just how destructive they were to indigenous families, and how horrifically, mind-twistingly abusive they were to individual students. But of course, because we're the good North American country, this kind of goes under discussed, even though it lasted into the 70s. The specific nature of CIA interference in South America is another big one, to me. Quietly aiding and abetting massive and grotesque human rights abuses and undermining governments the US saw as inconvenient or uncooperative seems to me like exactly the kind of conspiratorial stuff that people nowadays would fly into a frenzy over. Alberta also had a eugenics program from 1928 to 1972. We learn about the residential schools but not about that one. Over 2,800 people were sterilized for everything from having Down syndrome, low IQ, normal IQ, degeneracy, and so on. The Alberta Eugenics Board approved 99% of cases, so they were not exactly selective. There have been many lawsuits. Belgium's King Leopold killed 10 million inches the Congo, chopping off hands and feet of women and children if workers did not meet daily quotas. They brought in cannibals from the interior and put babies in boiling pots for the cannibals to eat in front of parents to keep them in submission. I was taught in school that 10 million is likely an exaggerated number from the British, and that the true number is between 3 and 5 million. But yes, what he did was horrible. Although you made a mistake, King Leopold is the one that fought for Belgium's independence, and won. You are thinking of Leopold II. Essentially every country has a past that includes slavery, horrible dictators, gruesome wars, and people being awful to each other. And usually in the past 500 years. Except for Sealand. Throughout the later half of the 20th century, Albania was controlled by a ruthless and paranoid dictator named Enver Hoxha. He essentially turned this small Balkan country into the North Korea of Europe. Hodzer was initially aligned with the Soviet Union and tried very hard to impress Nikita Khrushchev. But when Khrushchev showed up for a visit and made some disparaging remarks about the country, ties were severed and Hodzer looked to Mao's China as a new best friend. Of course, China was thousands of miles from Albania, with an extremely different language and culture, so that didn't last very long. Eventually the country became a hermit kingdom, completely closed off from the outside world. Almost nobody was allowed in, very few were allowed out, and everyone was monitored around the clock by a large and powerful secret service. Under the Hodzer regime, Albanians were forced to construct thousands upon thousands of concrete bunkers to prepare for foreign attacks. Knives were hung from telephone poles so citizens could use them against hordes of Greek paratroopers that never came, and never even planned to. Albanians labored away in the fields using medieval technology that was unable to feed the growing population. Most types of art and music from the outside world were outlawed, and ancient houses of worship were destroyed or defaced. For a while, there was even a national dress code. Although Enver Hoxha claimed to have established the first officially atheist state, it's pretty clear that he had tried to start a new religion of his own, with him as prophet and savior. Torture, executions, and disappearances continued for decades. In 1991, Albania became the last country in Europe to open up to the outside world after the Iron Curtain had fallen. The world proved too much to catch up with. The opening of Albania was followed by a decade of riots, looting, piracy, gang wars, human trafficking and kidnappings, nearly reaching a state of civil war by 1997. Then, for whatever reason, it all simmered down. I have visited Albania several times since those years and never ceased to be amazed by the kindness and warmth of an ancient people who have endured so much in surprisingly recent memory. During the Irish Civil War in 1922, prisoners were often executed out of hand, including, infamously, by tying a bunch of them to a landmine and detonating it. Romania's neo-Stalinism regime. Ceausescu tried to get a bigger population by Decree 770. Birth control and sexual education were illegal. Families should have 5 kids, abortions were illegal, and when an illegal abortion led to an infection it was illegal to treat the woman. 10,000 women died. A lot of kids were born. There wasn't enough food. The families sent their kids to asylums, more like children gulags. Most of them were overcrowded and the kids were forced to live on the streets, which was still better than living in such an asylum. My English is too bad to describe the situation in these asylums. Just take your worst imagination and multiply it with the fact that the asylum staffs often stated those kids should have been killed right after their birth, and I personally would choose death over a childhood in such a children gulag. Their Department of State Security also killed protesters after a speech. They were involved in experiments leading to torture and murders among prisoners. They were involved in deportations and purges. Their body count is estimated around 200,000. Ceausescu was sentenced to death by the Romanian army. If you are from Europe, you probably hear a lot about organized beggar clans. This guy is the reason why we have to deal with those clans. The population is still suffering from the regime's aftermath. How bad the Romanian orphanages were is expressed through one simple bit of knowledge. They were a treasure trove of research material about child development. Specifically, the lack thereof. Let's not forget that when there was a strike, Ceausescu ordered the leaders to be given 5-minute chest x-rays. You know, so they'd die of cancer in a few years. This man was so hated that his downfall was a speech he had prepared to calm everyone down. When he fled, his helicopter pilot feigned a malfunction and dumped him in a field. When he found a driver willing to take him, the driver told him he'd hide him somewhere safe, which he did, and promptly got the new regime. This man, and his wife, were sentenced to death and executed so rapidly that the cameraman missed the execution because he was changing the battery. In a way he was lucky. He was so hated that people didn't even bother to torture him, which I'm sure many Romanians would have signed up for. Japan during World War II was much worse than Germany when it came to human experimentation. The worst part of it is that they got immunity for it in exchange for their research results. Cromwell murdered a lot of Irish Catholics and Trail of Tears them. To hell or Connacht. I can't work out why people still hold him up as a hero. The guy employed an official iconoclast to smash down blasphemous statuary, murdered thousands and instituted a theocratic dictatorship that pretended it was a republic. He also banned Christmas. Caribbean and South American slaves. This was actually where the lion's share of slaves went once they left Africa. The conditions of any type of slavery were brutal, but this was among the worst. Sugar plantations often had worse conditions than other destinations. Additionally, they weren't considered to be as high cost, so they were treated worse. I know North America gets a lot of, correct, blame for the shameful history of slavery, but it's a shameful history we share with a lot of our geographical neighbors. Pol Pot's Cambodia. First they killed my father. Bai Lungung does a pretty good job of detailing just how fucking horrific life under the Khmer Rouge Anchor really was. The independent state of Croatia, NDH. They were so evil, they were even too much for the Nazis. Japan's imperialism in World War II. Search up area room, I don't fully remember, 731, and you'll see many instances of human experimentation. I have two that I remember from living in Shanghai, China. The first one, my freshman year of high school, I went on a school-sponsored week-long trip that was all about the Asian side of World War II. We went to Hiroshima for 3 days, then back to Shanghai for a day, and then Nanjing for 2-3 days. When in Nanjing, we went to a museum highlighting the Nanjing massacre. Japanese soldiers invaded and basically wreaked havoc on several Chinese cities and communities, the most egregious being in Nanjing. The Japanese wanted the Chinese to surrender by a certain date, but when they didn't surrender, the Japanese general basically let the army use all force they want to. The soldiers committed crimes including slaughter, rape, cannibalism, theft, arson, etc. The museum had so many eyewitness accounts that were so brutal in detailing the number 300,000. The number of people killed was plastered on almost every wall of the museum. The thing my classmates and I noticed was how much that museum differed from Hiroshima's Peace Museum, the atom bomb one, in that the Hiroshima one promoted peace while the Nanjing one promoted remembering the atrocity. This is probably because the Japanese government and education system hides this event. The teacher leading the trip, who had led it every year for a good 5 years at that point, remembered native Japanese students and especially how one girl was so shocked and mortified that her home country did this. The second one, after the first one, this is kinda ironic because the Chinese government hides this from anyone and everyone in any way they can. China is known for covering up anything and everything to save face, even blocking websites, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc., to prevent information from getting into the hands of the Chinese population. In 1989, Chinese students protested in Tiananmen Square, calling for the establishment of democracy, the implementation of free speech, and an end to corruption in the Communist Party. In response, the Chinese military arrived and started shooting and even running over protesters. While it did turn into an all-out war between both sides, the protesters had been mostly peaceful, with the most extreme actions being hunger strikes. The incident was swept under the rug by the Chinese government and the Communist Party, still in power today. They are so meticulous about it that Google searches get blocked if certain keywords are detected. In fact, for about 2 weeks in late May early June, almost the entire site is blocked to prevent people from learning about the massacre, which made homework for me very hard. I remember my mom told a Chinese friend about the event and asked her opinion, and said friend, who was I believe 25 when we knew her, had no idea that it even happened. Most of our native Chinese friends had no idea or even denied it. Also, a funny addendum to the censorship in China, I remember in 8th grade history class, we had a unit on China and were given textbooks on the entire history of China. 2 pages would be dedicated to aspects sections of Chinese history. I remember getting my book and turning to the pages in the middle on communism, pages 98-99, on a whim. I noticed that the pages were torn in pieces of ripped paper covered parts of the pages. I thought someone had accidentally spilt something on the pages and didn't think much of it. Then one day, my teacher simply says, turn to page 98. The entire class got confused as they flipped through the pages of their books. All of them flipped back and forth between pages 97 and 100. The books had been imported from the US and at customs, someone went through the book and censored the books with any damning Chinese history. With this book, they glued the pages on communism together since the author wrote about it with an American lens. Everyone's pages were glued together except for mine, which were separated because of some curious, persistent previous owner who wanted to know what it said. I remember the teacher looking pleased with himself as everyone realized what happened. I mentioned that my pages were separated. My teacher comes up and looks at the pages for a really long time. I thought he thought something was wrong, but I shortly realized that he probably used these books for years and it was the first time he had a chance to actually see what was on those 2 pages. The Bosnian Genocide. I used to work as a carer for elderly Australian Aboriginal men and women, and many of them had been tattooed with the name of the person that owned them during the period where, sadly, slavery was legal. One such resident had been tattooed on both legs, arms and front and back of their torso with large capital letters of their slave owner's full name. This kind of tattooing happened a lot in the 1960s, 1970s, and earlier, when all that evil shit was still legal, long after it had been abolished in other countries. Trust me, I wanted to take that name I saw tattooed on this poor man and use that information to beat the ever-living fuck out of the cunt who had caused such pain and humiliation to such a strong, intelligent and peaceful person. Australia has a monstrous history when it comes to the treatment of our original peoples. People today go boo-hoo, why should we have a national sorry day? They're fucked in the head if they think what white settlers did to these men and women and children was anything short of genocide and torture.